Father, thank you that we could be here for this church, for this community, Lord, for all that you've done in us, through us, and we pray, Lord, in the lives of many who will come to know you. We pray this in your name. Amen. So a real brief, it's Resurrection Sunday, right? So there's only like 2 or 3 places in Scripture where we always go to look at the resurrection. I'm not going to do that today, so that's a bummer because I got like 12 of those sermons. I could have just pulled one out. You wouldn't even remember. But this is how you know it's a new one. So anyway, if you're just joining us, we've been going through the book of Exodus. And the goal in looking at this Old Testament story is to look at it through the fresh lens of saying, what does it tell us about our story? How is the Old Testament story in Exodus really our story? Because so many of us view it as like foundational to the real story. It's like background material for the real story. Some people call it flyover reading. If you ever tried to do, reading the Bible in a year plan, and you get to some of these Old Testament books, and you're like, I'm going to skim this at best. Just get through it, get the main points, get the big picture, and move on. But in reality, the Old Testament story is God's unfolding story, and it's our story. It's the story that you and I, as most of us, Gentiles, non-Jewish people, were grafted into this story of Israel. So we want to know what it means for us. So unfortunately, if it's the first Sunday that you're here, you're stepping into the very last sermon in this series. But I think you're still going to be able to grasp it. All the other sermons are online. If you go home and go, what was he talking about? You can go listen to them. But a brief summary is that Israel has been slaves in Egypt. We've been introduced to this main character, Moses, one of the main characters. Moses has rescued them from Pharaoh. Yahweh has rescued them from Pharaoh in Egypt through using Moses as the guide and leader. They've gone through the Red Sea. They've gone to the wilderness. The last time we saw them, they're at Mount Sinai, and we look at this story where they worship a golden calf. And then now here we are. And so what we're going to look at today is going to require a bit of time travel. Okay, we're going to be going backwards in time, forwards in time, in order to look at Moses and discover more about what he tells us about our own salvation. On Friday night, we considered, and I said this, I said, if you really want to read the book of the Exodus through the lens of what it tells you about Moses, you wouldn't be far off from figuring out the point of the whole story. That Moses acts as this mediator and representative head of the people. But on Good Friday, we considered that Moses wasn't able to go all the way. That Moses couldn't actually stand in for the people. He offered God his eternal security. He says, hey, you know what, blot me out of the story, but forgive these people. And God politely declines. Moses doesn't have the ability to stand in for the people. But Jesus does. And that's what we considered on Good Friday. So we're going to look back now as we consider and celebrate Jesus' resurrection. I want to look again at the life and specifically the death of Moses, which feels a little depressing on Easter, right? Like, let's go look at the death of Moses. Whatever. Let's see what happens, all right? So I'm gonna read this, or let me give us the background real quick, because here's where we're at in the story. Like I said, it requires a bit of time travel. After Israel is rescued from Egypt, they cross the Red Sea, they go into the wilderness, and a couple of weeks ago, we looked at the fact that they clamor for bread. Okay, they said, we need bread, we're hungry, we're going to die out here. But right before that story, there was a little story that we, just sort of looked at as an aside, where God, they're walking through the wilderness, and they realize they need water. And they come upon this little stream, this little brook, maybe a sitting body of water, and it's called Marah, because Marah means bitter. And so this water is bitter. And they complain to God, and they complain to Moses, and so Moses takes a log, and he throws it in the bitter water, and the water becomes sweet. Now, when we looked at that story, and all the people are able to drink, and when I looked at that story, one of the points I made was that the story is not really about God's provision of water. Because immediately following it, they turn a corner in the road, they move on from this bitter spring, and there's this gorgeous oasis with 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees. So God knew that if I just push them a little bit further, they're going to come to water. They're going to come to an oasis. God did not need to give them water at that moment. But the point of the story and what God says is he goes, the reason that I healed this water for you, the reason that I made this bitter water and turned it sweet, was because you need to know that if you follow me and you obey me, I will be your healer. I'm not going to bring calamity on you like I brought to the Egyptians. I'm going to bring healing on you. And so he uses this cleansing of the water as sort of a metaphor of who he will be to them. And they go on and they find this great oasis. So following that, the people grumble about bread. God sends them so much manna, it's literally coming out their nose. Like they have bread for days. They're eating just so much every day as they need for the day, and then there's plenty more the next day. On the sixth day, there's enough for 2 days. And so that's where we ended the story. We turn to the Gospel of John. Jesus is the bread of life, the eternal bread of life. Well, it's immediately after God has provided the quail and the manna. So God has provided the people food that we jump into our story in Exodus 17. All the congregation of the people moved on from the wilderness of Sin by stages according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." And Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" But the people thirsted there for water, and the people grumbled against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried to the Lord, "What shall I do with this people? They're almost ready to stone me." And the Lord said to Moses, "Pass on before the people, taking with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, and the people will drink." And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. And he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the quarreling of the people of Israel, and because they tested the Lord by saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" Now, in this story, the people of God have just seen God's provision in the form of bread and in the form of quail. So they have bread and they have meat every day. And I think it's really easy for us to sit in our seat of judgment where we have all our provision for the most part. Most of us, hopefully today, aren't worried about bread or water or food. And so we look at the people of Israel and we're like, man, these people are constantly complaining. Why don't they have any faith in God that he's going to provide for them when they're in the middle of the wilderness? Why don't they trust that God's going to provide for them water? He's already done that. And so it's really easy for us to be judgmental when we're not actually suffering in their circumstances. But, what we have to consider is that this is a group of people, probably 2 million strong, plus all their livestock, and they're walking through this incredibly dry land. Like, not only is the ground dry and hard, but the air is dry. There's no humidity at all. We were at a trailhead walking this hike in Israel, and it was like any trailhead that you've ever been to. There's a little sign that outlines the different paths that you can take, and at the center of this park that we were in was a wadi, which is a stream that gets built up during the rainy season. But this wadi in particular had a spring in the middle of it, and so in the midst of this desert, arid region, there's this spring that bubbles up, and many people think it was this spring where David and his mighty men hung out when Saul was trying to capture them and kill them. So anyway, you have to get to this wadi. Once you get there, the water is fresh and clear, and you can drink it, and it's amazing, and it's a great place to cool down. But on the way, as you're walking, it says on the trailhead board, do not even attempt to go on this trail unless you have 4 liters of water. 4 liters of water is a lot of water. I got to tell you. I had a Camelback, one of those Camelback backpacks that has the water reservoir in the back, and I have the 3-liter version, which meant that fully packed out in my hiking backpack was not enough water even just for me. I needed at least another liter, and then because we were in a mixed group and with mixed ages and mixed, some women and some men, those of us who had the ability to carry more would carry even more water in the event that others needed it. And sure enough, even with all that water, people were having heat stroke. They were, almost passing out. Their bodies are betraying them. And these are people, granted, on the one hand you could say, well, these people from North America aren't used to this climate, right, in Israel. But you also have to realize that, these 2 million people walking through the desert, when they say we need water, they need water. I mean, they need it. You sweat, and you don't even know you sweat because the water evaporates before it does anything to cool you down. That's how you use up so much water. So these people are walking through the desert. They really, really, really need water. So they're grumbling, but I think we'd do well to think about how much we'd be grumbling if we were in that situation. Not to kind of sit in judgment from our positions of provision, but to imagine what it would feel like for them to be actually walking through that wilderness. So they complain to Moses. Moses goes to God. He's like, look, God, they're going to kill me. Like, this is for real down here. And God, notice what God says and does. It's so important. He says it's not just that God provides the water. He could have done that in any manner he chose. Right? He could have snapped his fingers. He could have been like he did last time, cut down that log. What God does is he says, I'm going to go in front of you, and I'm going to stand on that rock, and I want you to take the staff, and I want you to come, and I want you to hit the rock, and water is going to flow out of it. God is not like, what's wrong with these people? How could they not trust me? God walks in the center of them, and he walks up, and he demonstrates that he will be their provider. And Moses strikes the rock, and many people see this metaphorically as Moses actually striking Christ himself, or striking Yahweh, because Yahweh was standing on the rock. And the water flows, and the people drink. Now, this is the last line. Moses calls the place Massah and Meribah, because he said the people tested and quarreled. But what did they test and quarrel over? This is so important to this text. This was the last line. Go back to that slide, Maria. The last line of the text was this. He called the name of the place Massah and Meribah because of the quarreling of the people of Israel, because they tested the Lord, not by saying, will he bring us water? But they tested the Lord by saying, is he among us or not? That was the root of their distrust. Is God with us? And God responds by standing in their midst and delivering water to the people. So now we're going to jump forward 40 years. The people have arrived in the land of Canaan. They walk to the land of Canaan. They get there. After going to Mount Sinai, they hear the law. They commit to God. They go to Canaan. And immediately they get there and they turn around and they're afraid. They stand at the edge of Canaan. They send some spies into the land. And the spies come back and they're like, listen, beautiful land. Everything that we heard, there's only one problem. We never realized how small we are. These people are giants in this land. They're going to crush us like little bugs. They have grapes the size of our head. They have figs the size of watermelons. They probably didn't, I don't even know if they knew what watermelons were. But the point is, they were like, this land, we're going to die if we go. Their failure of nerve means that God, when they finally get there, God says, all right, I promised you the land. I provided for you. I told you we were going to take it. But because you don't trust me, you're going back into the wilderness. And they turn around and they wander back into the wilderness for 40 years. And God says, this first generation of people who came here, you're not getting the land. You're going to go back into the wilderness. Which brings us to Numbers chapter 20. So now it's been 40 years. The Israelites have been in the wilderness that whole time. God is guiding them through it, not allowing them to get to the promised land. And here's what happens in Numbers 20. They come to a place that would have been very familiar to this second generation now of Israelites, because they would have heard the story. Their parents would have told them. They knew what the place was called. And so they come to this place, a second generation of Israelites, 40 years after the first time in Numbers 20. And the people of Israel, the whole congregation, come into the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed in Kadesh. And Miriam died there and was buried there. Now there was no water for the congregation. And they assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron. And the people quarreled with Moses and said, would that we had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. Why have you brought the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness? And why should we die here, both we and our cattle? And why have you made us come up out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It's no place for grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, and there's no water to drink. Then Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting and fell on their face. And the glory of the Lord appeared to them. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and Aaron your brother, and tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water. So you shall bring water out of the rock for them and give drink to the congregation and their cattle. And Moses took the staff from before the Lord as he had commanded them. Isn't it crazy how history repeats itself? I mean, you see it here. It happens in all of our lives, right? Like this is, in some cases, one of the worst things about having children. There's so many wonderful things, children. We all love you. You're great. But one of the hardest things is that you have your children and then they reflect back to you all of your terrible qualities, right? Like they will either call them out and say, why do you always get so angry? And you're like, oh, that is it, you know? Or they have the same tendencies, right, that you have, and you look at them and you're like, why are you insane? And you're like, oh, shoot, that was my bad. That was my fault. And so here you have these Israelites, 40 years later, it's the second generation. They come to the place, the very same place. They say the same thing, not like, oh, good. We remember this story from our parents, right? This is a place that God made water come out of that rock, the one right there. Instead, they're like, seriously, Moses? You brought us here to die of thirst? Why did you even bother bringing us out of Egypt? Which, to Moses, has got to be like, are you kidding me? It's been like 40 some odd years at this point, and you're still talking about you wish you were in Egypt. And so they ask the same question. God says to them, look, take your staff, listen, go over to that rock and speak to it. Here's what happens. Then Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock? And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank and their livestock. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe me, to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. These are the waters of Meribah, where the people of Israel quarreled with the Lord, and through them he showed himself holy. Here's the conclusion of Moses' story in Deuteronomy 34. The people now have arrived at the land. This is what happens to Moses. Then Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho. And the Lord showed him all the land, Gilead as far as Dan, all of Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the western sea, the Negev and the plain, that is, the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees as far as Zoar. And the Lord said to him, this is the land of which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to your offspring. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not go over there. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And he buried him in the valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor. But no one knows the place of his burial to this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eye was undimmed, and his vigor unabated. And the people of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. Then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses were ended. And Joshua, the son of Nun, was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands on him. So the people of Israel obeyed and did as the Lord had commanded Moses, and there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. None like him, for all the signs and wonders that the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his servants and all his land, and for all the mighty power and all the great deeds of terror that Moses did in the sight of all of Israel. If we're being honest, the end of Moses' story is extraordinarily depressing. Can you imagine that you've been leading a group of people for 40 years now, a task that you didn't even want? Okay, you were perfectly happy. Moses was perfectly happy, doing his thing, watching his flocks, when God pops in and says, I got a job for you to do. And then, after you do it faithfully, and you actually get them to the promised land, because by the way, when God first saw Moses, he's like, you're going to lead them out here to to Mount Sinai, they're going to worship, you're going to get them to the promised land, but it wasn't like, oh, by the way, it's going to take you 40 years longer than you thought. In her book, Strengthening the Soul of Her Leadership, or Strengthening the Soul of Your Leadership, Ruth Haley Barton, by the way, highly recommend this book. Ruth Haley Barton goes through the life of Moses, pointing out how you can become stronger as a leader, but it's really for everybody. She points out that as she becomes an adult, she sees more and more as this act of God is just being straight up cruel. Like, you've led the whole time, And now, I'm going to get you to, you can glimpse at it, you can see the land, but you can't go in. Like, I'm going to withhold from you the promised land. Other people are going to get to do it, but you're not. And for what? Like one little act of defiance? Like, that's all it takes, and all of a sudden there's this cruelty that God's going to deliver to you? He's 120 years old. You ever meet somebody who's 120? They're pretty grumpy. Of course he struck the rock. He's frustrated. Makes one measly mistake. Instead of speaking to the rock, he hits it 2 times, and God is like, that's it, you're not going to the promised land. There's punishment, and then there's cruel and unusual punishment, and this feels like the latter. But Barton goes on to point out that perhaps we're thinking of it incorrectly. Maybe Moses doesn't seem to mind. Maybe Moses is content. And the reason that we're looking at this today on Easter of all days, the most joyous of Christian days, why are we looking at the death of Moses? It's this. Why are we looking at Moses' failure to enter the promised land? Because what I would suggest to you is that he didn't fail to enter the promised land. It's just that the promised land is different than what we all thought. That the promised land is different from what we all thought. There's a lot of discussion around why Moses was punished so severely. And it's worth thinking about, right? Like, I mean, he did disobey God, and it was a severe punishment. What was it that happened? I mean, so some people, again, go back and they say, well, God had already said that he was standing on this rock, and so for God to, for Moses to then take his staff and hit it twice was really an act of aggression towards God. Other people say that the real issue is that Moses was the leader, and he disobeyed God in front of the people. And listen, there's truth to that. Like, as leaders, if you are a leader and you lead any sort of people, you will be held to a higher standard of responsibility for the way that you behave, especially when you are standing in a position of authority. Especially when you are standing in front of people, what you're saying, what you're doing. You're going to be held accountable for those actions. We need to think about that. The truth was, though, that Moses was disobedient in the presence of the people of God, and it had consequences. This is why, when we move forward to Jesus, it's so significant that when Jesus is in the wilderness for 40 days, he doesn't disobey God. So when we talk about what Jesus accomplished, we sometimes say that it's his death and resurrection, right? Like, that's what we focus on, especially on the Easter week. We focus on Jesus' death and his resurrection as the thing of most significance, but we forget that it's Jesus' life that gave any sort of significance to his death and his resurrection. Jesus had to live a perfect life. Jesus had to be obedient in front of the people. Jesus couldn't disobey God. And if he did, then his fate would have been the same as Moses. He couldn't be the stand-in. He couldn't die as Moses does. Jesus has to live a perfect life. And so the author of Hebrews describes what Jesus accomplishes through his life, death, and resurrection. And he says in Hebrews that what the people were really seeking as they walked through the wilderness was the rest of God. That they wanted to enter into the Sabbath rest of God. That somehow, if they could get to the promised land, the experience that they would have would be to be in the presence of God, to experience the rest of God. That is what they were going for. This is how he equates it. That entering the promised land was equated with entering God's rest, the place where his presence would be. This is what's offered to us. This is what's offered to us through Christ. That Christ, in his life, death, and resurrection, the author of Hebrews goes on to say, offers you that Sabbath rest. That this is the promise. That through the life, death, and resurrection, we get to experience the presence of God. This is why, even when Jesus is on the cross, he's standing there, he's got the 2 thieves, right, to either side. And they're both, like, at one second, they're like hurling insults at him. And then finally, one of them gets it, like, this guy's different. And he says, remember me. That's like all he says. And Jesus says, today you will be with me in paradise. Today you're going to be with me in the promised land. Today you're going to make it. Like, you're going to be there with me, promised land. You're going to make it into this place of paradise. It's why Paul can say in the resurrection that Jesus is the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. What he's saying is that Jesus goes first. Jesus goes ahead of us. Jesus enters into the presence of God. Jesus is the first of all of us, the first of many. And so I think that in what Barton points out in her book is that in this apparent punishment where we think that God is being withholding to Moses, where he's just showing Moses what he's missing out on, what we're actually seeing is the grace of God. Because Moses climbs the mountain the last time. I love the text. It's like he was full of vigor. Like he's 120 years old. He's like, boom, climbing this mountain, no big deal. He gets to the top. He's there. He gazes out over the physical promised land. And God shows him the true promised land of being able to rest in his presence. That for the first time, Moses has the opportunity to be with God and just be with God. That for the first time, he experiences the presence. God has finally shown him what it's all about. It's not about entering that land, Moses. It's about entering into my presence. And you get to do it. You've done it. It's as if God has given Moses a reprieve. And he's like, that's enough now, son. Just come be with me. Moses is at peace with not being able to enter into the land of Canaan because he received something far better, being in God's presence. And, you know, think about what the text said. It says there's no other prophet that has come around like Moses because Moses knew God face to face. He knew God as a friend knows God. Isn't it significant? It's crazy that when we fast forward to the New Testament, we don't even really think about how profound this is. So you fast forward to the New Testament, and there's Jesus, and he takes his inner circle. He's like, we're going to go up on top of this mountain. They go up on top of the mountain, and Jesus transfigures into some sort of like spiritual, like post-resurrection appearance. And he's standing there, and he's just talking it up with two guys. Who are the two guys? Moses and Elijah. That the disciples see it, they don't know, they're scared out of their minds. They're like, well, should we build you a tent? Like, they don't know what to do. But the significance of it is that Moses and Elijah are talking to Jesus like old pals. This is Moses going up the mountain at the end of his life to rest in the presence of God. But it points forward to what Jesus actually accomplished. See, the problem is, Moses gets to go rest in the presence of God, but he can't get anybody through the door with him. That's great for Moses, but no one else could follow his lead. Jesus opens the door for everyone to enter the presence of God. Here's the reality of what happens at the death and resurrection of Jesus. We want there to be all these analogies, right? Like I was talking to Christy about this the other day. It's crazy because, and I think some of you talked about this at the CBS Bible study this week. We want to come up with all these analogies for what Jesus accomplished on the cross. I remember the one growing up, you know, it was like there's two mountains and there's a valley in between, and you can't get through the valley, but look at that, a cross fits perfectly in the middle, and you just walk across the cross and you get to the other side. And that was like, nailed it, right? We were like, oof, we've got this done. You know, what's so silly, and it's fine, right? Like, God is setting us up with the story the whole time. God is giving us the analogy because you don't need another analogy. God's like, from the very beginning, with the people coming out of Egypt, with everything, he goes on and he gives this analogy. He's like, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to be in your presence. So you're my people. I've got you. I'm going to be in your presence, and you're going to build for me a place where I'm going to dwell. It's going to be the tabernacle. And then later that's going to become the temple. And I'm going to dwell in the very innermost recesses of this place. You're going to build a little room for me, and that's where I'm going to be. And you can only come in, only one person, and they can come in one time a year. But nobody else can come in, and if you do, you die. Because you can't be in my presence. But I'm going to be there in the midst of this camp. And so if you walked into the tabernacle or you walked into the temple, there were all these barriers that you had to walk through that would get you further closer and further more inside to where God's presence was dwelling, where God was. But there was one last curtain. You couldn't go through that curtain. That was, only one person once a year could go through that final curtain, and everybody knew it. They knew what that curtain was. You can't be in the presence of God because of your sin, your lack of holiness. You can't make it through that. And there's all these boundaries. And then on the cross, as Jesus dies, that curtain in the temple gets ripped in two, and it gets ripped from top to bottom because God ripped the curtain. God's like, you don't need... I ripped the freaking curtain. You can come in. This is my presence. This is what I'm offering you. That you can be with me now. Humanity is given access to the presence of God, and the resurrection of Jesus on the third day is the guarantee. This is the whole point. See, a lot of times at Easter, we want to focus on the victory, and we can be victorious, and we can overcome. Oh, that's true. That's great. That's awesome. Okay, we want to focus on the victory. What he overcame and defeated, that death is no longer the final word, that everything has gotten reversed, and all of that is true. But what I want us to reflect on is this, that the greatest victory that Christ accomplished was ripping the curtain that stood between us and God's presence. That's what Moses got to experience, but we can never experience except through Christ. That even Moses ultimately needed Jesus to rip the curtain. That's the only way for us to have the presence of God. The same Yahweh that had to put up a fence around the mountain in case anyone would get too close and die is the same one that we have access to because of Jesus Christ, that we can be in the presence of God. Jesus has entered the promised land. The firstborn of many brothers and sisters, many sons and daughters of God who will come behind Jesus. Jesus goes into the promised land. He's cleared all the enemies. He's building up cities. He's building mansions so that when we get there, we're going to say the same thing that Israel said when they arrived in the land of Canaan. And they go in, and God's like, good luck. I just brought you into this land with cities you didn't build, vineyards you didn't plant, and houses you didn't furnish. And in the New Testament, we find out that's exactly what Jesus is doing for us in the presence of God that we already have access to. That we go up there and we go, hey, the house is already furnished. We just get to go. This is the reason the early apostles and Christians were willing to give their lives. It's why all of those other things they had victory over, it's why you couldn't take anything from them. They were like, what are you going to do? You're going to kill me? You're going to take all my stuff? You're going to take your money? You're going to give me beatings? I'm going to be shipwrecked? What does it matter to me? Because the resurrection guaranteed that I have access to the presence of God. The resurrection guarantees that I already have victory. The resurrection guarantees that I have already had access to the promised land. That I'm already there. There's no holding back for me. That is the message of the gospel. Father, thank you for this story of salvation that you've offered to us. First, through your people Israel, given to us, that we would be grafted into this story so that we can claim that we too, that our ancestors were slaves in Egypt. But you set them free. You brought them to the mountain. You brought them into the promised land. And Lord, finally revealed what it was about. It was about being in your presence. Lord, as we close and respond now, may we reflect on these words as we think about the resurrection, as we rejoice in it. Be with us in your name. Amen.